In this holy and mysterious story, at the very beginning, we discover a man born in the land of idols, the land of of the Chaldees. This man's name was Abram. However, his name will be known throughout the ages, not just as a man of faith, but also as the friend of God. But before the great things happen, we need to understand where he came from and what separated him from the world of idols surrounding him. Abram, born in the land of idolatry, where even the children of Eber had degenerated, was faced with a heavy choice: to remain in the comfort of his home or to follow God's will, even though it would mean leaving everything he knew. Terah, his father, was a man from an idolatrous world. He served other gods and lived in the same land known for its idol-worshipping traditions. But despite that, God chose Abram to be a guide for many generations, even though he was born in a land far from the true God. Abram, with his family, his father Terah, his wife Sarai, and his nephew Lot, leaves of the Chaldees, guided by God's call. But this was not a simple journey. They did not immediately head toward the promised land, Canaan. First, they stopped in Haran, a city situated halfway between and Canaan. Why? Because Terah, his father, was old and could not continue any further. And here, in Haran, Terah dies, leaving Abram and his family to reflect on the path they will take. But this is not the end of the journey. Abram, although carrying the heavy burden of grief for his family, does not give up. He carries God's call in his heart and continues forward without looking back at his past. Even though he had many reasons to stay, he trusted in God's direction and choice. Perhaps it seems that this was just a journey from one city to another. But behind this journey lay a great spiritual choice. It was a choice between the world he knew, full of idolatry, and the path that led to God's will, a path that would require many sacrifices but also great rewards. Abram was the youngest child of Terah. While it seemed he was the last, God had a special plan for him. And this is one of the greatest lessons. Sometimes the smallest or the least noticeable in the eyes of the world are those whom God uses to fulfill the greatest purposes. God chooses those whom the world may see as last to make them first in his kingdom. For Abram, this was not just a physical journey, but a spiritual path in which he had to leave behind his old nature, free himself from the idols of his past, and try to follow God's commandments, even when the path wasn't easy. In this, he became an example for us. Like many of us, he had his doubts and weaknesses, but his faith was what made him strong. The story of Abram is also the story of many of us. Perhaps all of us are placed on different paths in life, but even in those paths, God has his purposes. He does not choose according to human standards. Sometimes we don't understand where the path is leading, but we must believe that God's hand is guiding us, even when we cannot see the entire way before us. For choosing to step into the unknown, to follow God's call, is not easy. Many will give up halfway. Many will reach their Haran, a place where they will stop because it is a comfortable stopping point. But only those who will continue and fulfill God's will, like Abram, will see God's promises fulfilled. Thus, Abram prepares for the greatest journey, not only physically but spiritually. But do you know what is even more interesting? This story doesn't start with the entry into the land of Canaan. No, this story starts with the decision to leave the old land. This was the same journey that all of us must make, to leave behind our old nature, our sinful path, and try to follow God's commandments, even when it seems like a huge risk. Abram was not perfect, but he had faith. And with that faith, he became the father of many nations, and his name will live forever. Let this be our call, to lean on faith like Abram, and not be afraid to head toward God's land of promises. That path leads to eternal life. The weight of temptation and God's protection. The story of Abraham begins with a great promise from God. He was called out of his homeland to a new land, where he and his descendants would become a great nation. However, as with all great promises, trials came soon after. a famine struck the land of Canaan, and despite the promise God made to Abraham, the very land that was supposed to sustain him became barren and empty. Abraham, looking to survive, decided to travel to Egypt, a land known for its abundance of resources and food. Little did he know that this decision would lead to another test of his faith and trust in God. When Abraham and Sarah arrived in Egypt, they were faced with a new peril. Sarah, Abraham's wife, was an exceedingly beautiful woman, and Abraham, out of fear for his life, thought that the Egyptians would take her for themselves and kill him in the process. In a moment of weakness and fear, Abraham decided to tell the Egyptians that Sarah was not his wife, but rather his sister, hoping that this would protect him from harm. While it was technically true that Sarah was his half-sister, Abraham's statement was made with the intention of deceiving and avoiding danger. In doing so, he placed both his wife and himself in a precarious position. By lying about Sarah's true relationship to him, Abraham not only put his wife at risk, but also dishonored her. The consequences of this decision were far-reaching, and his actions did not go unnoticed by God. In his mercy, God did not abandon Abraham or Sarah. Despite their moment of failure, God's protection remained steadfast. As Sarah was brought into the house of Pharaoh, God intervened in a way that only he could. The Lord sent plagues upon Pharaoh's household, and it was through these plagues that Pharaoh became aware of the true nature of Sarah's identity. The suffering and confusion that spread through Pharaoh's house served as a clear sign to him that something was deeply wrong. It was in this moment of divine intervention that Pharaoh called Abraham to him. His words were not filled with rage, but with righteous indignation. "What have you done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife?" Pharaoh had acted out of ignorance, and in his confusion, he reproached Abraham for his deceit. The king was angry, not only because Abraham's actions had placed him in a difficult position, but because Abraham's lack of honesty and trust in God had led him to sin. Pharaoh realized that the true reason for the plagues was God's protection of Sarah, and that God had not allowed him to sin by taking another man's wife. This was a pivotal moment in the life of Abraham. Though his faith had faltered, God's grace and mercy remained evident. God's protection, even in the midst of Abraham's fear and disobedience, served as a powerful reminder that God is faithful, even when his people are not. Pharaoh, upon understanding the situation, did not punish Abraham, but instead returned Sarah to him, along with a command to leave Egypt. Pharaoh respected Abraham, realizing that God's favor was upon him, and sent him away with wealth and provisions. For Abraham, this experience marked a turning point. He had been afraid, and that fear had led him to dishonesty and compromise. Yet God, in his mercy, turned Abraham's wrong into something that ultimately worked for his good. The wealth Abraham received from Pharaoh was a blessing, but it was also a sign of God's continued provision. God was fulfilling his promises to Abraham, even when Abraham failed to fully trust in him. One of the most powerful lessons in this part of Abraham's journey is the reminder that fear and distrust in God can lead to sin. Abraham, a man known for his great faith, was susceptible to the same fears that all humans experience. When faced with a threat, Abraham, like many of us, allowed fear to cloud his judgment and lead him into a sin that could have cost him dearly. However, this moment also shows us the incredible mercy of God. Even when Abraham's actions were less than honorable, God did not abandon him or his wife. Instead, God intervened, protecting Sarah from harm and bringing about a resolution that allowed Abraham to continue on his journey. This story, though marked by deceit and fear, is ultimately one of redemption. It highlights the ways in which God can use even our mistakes for his purposes. It also underscores the importance of honesty and trust in God. Had Abraham trusted in God's protection from the beginning, he would not have fallen into this trap. Yet even in his failure, God's grace was evident. This is a recurring theme in the lives of God's people. Though they falter, God's faithfulness remains unwavering. His protection and provision are always available to those who trust in Him. Abraham's fear also serves as a warning to us. How often do we allow our own fears to dictate our actions? How often do we, in moments of uncertainty, compromise on our values or lie to protect ourselves? Yet, just as God was faithful to Abraham, He is faithful to us. When we place our trust in Him, He will provide for us, even when we are unsure of the future. In the end, this story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of trust in God's promises. Abraham's faith was tested, but God remained faithful. Even when we falter, God's grace is sufficient, and His protection is always with us.